The legislative chambers of the United States have long served as the crucible for national identity, where the friction between oversight and executive authority sparks intense public discourse. In a recent high-stakes hearing that captured the attention of the nation, the atmosphere was thick with the weight of constitutional duty and partisan tension. Representative Moskowitz took the floor to deliver a scathing critique aimed at Secretary Kristi Noem and the broader administrative strategies employed during times of national crisis. This confrontation was not merely a clash of personalities, but a fundamental debate over the ethical obligations of those entrusted with public safety and institutional integrity. The discourse centered on a perceived shift from proactive de-escalation to the strategic dissemination of inflammatory rhetoric following incidents of significant public violence. The allegations presented during this session suggested a systemic failure to prioritize social cohesion over political posturing in the wake of national tragedies. Moskowitz argued that the leadership displayed by high-ranking officials had strayed dangerously far from the traditional mandate of calming the populace. Instead of utilizing the vast resources of the federal government to bridge divides, the rhetoric coming from the executive branch appeared to exacerbate existing social fractures. This critique highlights a broader concern regarding how modern administrations navigate the fine line between informing the public and influencing them through polarized narratives. The hearing thus became a landmark moment for evaluating the standards to which the American people hold their appointed and elected leaders. A primary point of contention involved the swift classification of a violent incident as domestic terrorism by Secretary Noem before a comprehensive investigation had concluded. Such labels carry immense legal and social weight, often altering the trajectory of justice and public perception in ways that are difficult to reverse. Moskowitz characterized this rush to judgment as a breach of professional conduct, suggesting that it prioritized a specific political narrative over the pursuit of factual accuracy. This specific instance was used to illustrate a broader pattern of what the congressman described as a national embarrassment regarding the handling of sensitive information. The debate underscores the critical need for administrative restraint when dealing with volatile situations that can easily ignite further civil unrest across the country. Furthermore, the management of the Federal Emergency Management Agency became a focal point for intense scrutiny during the proceedings. As the primary body responsible for disaster response and recovery, FEMA occupies a unique position of trust within the American bureaucratic framework. Allegations of mismanagement within this agency suggest that the logistical and humanitarian functions of the state were being compromised by internal dysfunction or political interference. Moskowitz contended that when a crisis strikes, the citizenry expects a seamless and objective response rather than a platform for partisan maneuvering or administrative incompetence. The effectiveness of federal relief efforts is often the most visible metric of a government's success or failure in serving its people during their most vulnerable moments. The hearing also brought to light a significant breakdown in the traditional mechanisms of constitutional oversight that define the relationship between the legislative and executive branches. When Moskowitz called for the subpoena of Attorney General Pam Bondi, he signaled a move toward using the full extent of congressional power to demand transparency. This demand reflects a growing frustration with what some perceive as a lack of cooperation from executive officials when faced with legitimate inquiries. The authority to compel testimony is a cornerstone of the American system of checks and balances designed to ensure that no individual or office is above the law. By targeting the highest legal officer in the land, the committee emphasized that the accountability of the government must be absolute and beyond the reach of political loyalty. This confrontation serves as a stark reminder of the ongoing struggle for transparent leadership in an era defined by rapid information cycles and deep political divisions. The call for accountability is not just about correcting past mistakes, but about setting a precedent for how future administrations should conduct themselves in the public eye. Moskowitz's rejection of blind political loyalty in favor of rigorous oversight resonates with a segment of the public that feels increasingly alienated by partisan rhetoric. The pursuit of truth in governance requires a willingness to challenge one's own party and to prioritize the foundational principles of the republic over short-term political gains. As the session progressed, it became clear that the stakes involved the very survival of public trust in democratic institutions. The rhetoric used by officials after incidents of violence has profound implications for the legal system and the protection of civil liberties. When leaders use inflammatory language, they risk creating an environment where due process is overshadowed by public outrage and political expediency. The analysis of Secretary Noem's actions during the hearing points to a fundamental disagreement on the role of a leader during a crisis of safety. Should a leader be a source of calm and factual information or a voice that echoes the most extreme sentiments of their political base? This question remains at the heart of the American political debate as the nation continues to grapple with the consequences of its internal divisions and the challenges of modern governance. The technical complexities of federal crisis management require a level of precision that transcends the typical boundaries of political debate. When the Federal Emergency Management Agency finds itself at the center of a legislative firestorm, it raises fundamental questions about the resilience of the administrative state. The criticisms leveled during the hearing suggested that the operational integrity of the agency had been undermined by a shift in focus toward ideological alignment rather than logistical excellence. Efficiency in distributing resources to disaster-stricken areas is often the only shield against total social collapse during a national emergency. Consequently, any perceived deviation from this mission is treated not just as a failure of policy, but as a betrayal of the public trust. The institutional history of FEMA reveals a delicate balance between local autonomy and federal intervention, which becomes particularly strained during periods of intense political polarization. Moskowitz's focus on the mismanagement of this agency underscores a broader concern that the bureaucracy is becoming increasingly susceptible to executive overreach. When the chain of command is used to advance a specific narrative, rather than to solve immediate logistical problems, the safety of the citizenry is placed at risk. This legislative scrutiny serves as a necessary check to ensure that the machinery of government remains focused on its primary duty of protection and recovery. The debate highlights the necessity for a professional civil service that can operate independently of the prevailing political winds. Legal scholars often point to the subpoena power of Congress as the ultimate tool for ensuring that executive officials remain accountable to the law. The demand for Attorney General Pam Bondi to testify reflects a strategic escalation in the pursuit of administrative transparency and judicial impartiality. This move is significant because the Department of Justice is intended to function as an independent arbiter of law rather than a legal defense team for the administration. When the boundaries between political loyalty and legal duty become blurred, the very foundation of the American justice system is called into question. The hearing thus served as a public test of whether the legislature could still effectively exert its constitutional authority over a defiant executive branch. The classification of events as domestic terrorism is another area where the intersection of law and politics creates a volatile environment for civil rights. In the American legal framework, such a designation triggers a wide array of investigative powers and societal consequences that can impact the lives of millions. By challenging Secretary Noem on her rapid use of this terminology, Moskowitz was highlighting the danger of using legal labels as tools for political branding. A rush to judgment in the absence of verified intelligence can lead to the erosion of due process and the unfair targeting of specific communities based on ideological grounds. This aspect of the discourse emphasizes the importance of maintaining a high evidentiary standard even in the heat of a national crisis. Transparency in leadership is not merely a moral preference but a functional requirement for the stability of a diverse and democratic society. When officials are accused of spreading misinformation, it creates a vacuum of truth that is quickly filled by fear and conspiracy theories. The legislative record of this hearing reflects an urgent need to establish clear standards for how high-ranking appointees communicate with the public. Reliable information is the currency of a functioning democracy, and when that currency is debased, the entire system of self-governance begins to falter. The insistence on accountability seen in the committee room is a reflection of a broader societal demand for a return to factual and responsible governance. The relationship between the Attorney General and the President has always been a subject of intense scrutiny regarding the independence of the executive branch's legal arm. By seeking the testimony of Pam Bondi, the committee was attempting to uncover the extent to which legal decisions were being influenced by political directives. This inquiry is essential because the public must have confidence that the law is applied equally to all individuals regardless of their political connections. A failure to uphold this principle can lead to a crisis of legitimacy that weakens every other institution of the American government. The hearing underscored that the pursuit of justice must be transparent and free from the shadow of partisan influence if it is to be respected. The operational doctrine of FEMA is built upon the Stafford Act, which outlines the specific conditions under which federal assistance can be deployed to aid states and localities. During the hearing, it was suggested that these protocols might have been bypassed or manipulated to favor certain jurisdictions over others based on political alignment. Such allegations, if proven, would represent a fundamental violation of the principles of federalism and equal protection under the law. The complexity of coordinating thousands of federal employees and billions of dollars in aid requires a leadership that is above reproach and dedicated to objective criteria. The intense questioning of Secretary Noem aimed to expose whether the agency had remained faithful to its statutory mission or had become a tool for executive favoritism. Congressional committees possess the inherent right to investigate any matter related to the legislative functions of government, including the performance of executive departments. This authority is backed by centuries of American legal precedent, which affirms that sunlight is the best disinfectant for corruption and mismanagement. When Representative Moskowitz confronted the administration officials, he was acting as a representative of the people's right to know how their government operates. The tension in the room was a manifestation of the friction that the Founding Fathers intentionally built into the system to prevent any one branch from becoming too powerful. Every question asked during the session was a brick in the wall of defense against the potential for administrative tyranny or neglect. The concept of de-escalation is not just a tactical choice for law enforcement, but a strategic necessity for political leaders during times of civil unrest. When leaders choose to use inflammatory language, they are essentially pouring gasoline on a fire that they have a sworn duty to extinguish. The hearing highlighted a perceived shift away from this traditional role of the executive as a unifying force in the wake of violence. Instead, the rhetoric described in the transcript suggests a calculated attempt to use conflict as a means of mobilizing a political base rather than healing a community. This departure from conventional leadership norms raises serious questions about the future of social stability in a nation already divided by deep ideological rifts. The role of the Secretary of a federal department involves managing complex logistical networks that provide essential services to millions of American citizens daily. Secretary Noem's leadership was called into question not just for her words, but for the perceived failure of the systems under her control to respond effectively to crises. In the American system of government, the heads of departments are accountable to both the President who appoints them and the Congress that funds them. This dual accountability is designed to ensure that the executive branch does not operate in a vacuum of its own making. The hearing provided a platform for the legislative branch to reassert its role as a co-equal partner in the governance of the nation. Administrative accountability often hinges on the paper trail of communications and directives that flow between high-ranking officials and their subordinates. Moskowitz's demand for a subpoena was a direct attempt to access this trail and determine where the breakdown in leadership actually occurred. In the digital age, the speed with which misinformation can spread necessitates an even greater commitment to accuracy and transparency from government sources. When the official record of a government agency is at odds with the public statements of its leaders, it creates a dangerous confusion that can have real-world consequences. The investigation into FEMA and the Department of Justice is therefore an investigation into the very soul of the American administrative apparatus. The legacy of a political administration is often defined by its response to unexpected events that test the strength of its institutions and the character of its leaders. The hearing captured a moment where the current administration's legacy was being contested in real time through the lens of legislative oversight. By characterizing the handling of recent events as a national embarrassment, the opposition sought to frame the narrative of administrative failure for the public record. This framing is a powerful tool in American politics used to influence public opinion and shape the outcomes of future elections and policy debates. The rigor of the questioning reflects the high stakes involved in defining the truth of the government's actions during a period of national turmoil. Noi dung teep tuc duok mo rong voi cac fan tik vi triad hoc chintri, gwynhan qua cac nan chinfu, vacac chu teep vi qe trin lapfap tai doi capital de dam bad du dai va tin chuyen sao. The pursuit of constitutional oversight requires a tireless commitment to the details of governance that often go unnoticed by the general public until a crisis erupts. The focus on Attorney General Pam Bondi's potential testimony is a testament to the belief that the legal framework of the nation must remain insulated from the pressures of partisan combat. If the highest legal officer in the land is seen as a partisan actor, it erodes the foundation of trust upon which the entire judicial system is built. The hearing served as a reminder that the defense of democracy is a constant process of questioning, investigating, and demanding better from those in power. As the session drew to a close, the unresolved questions regarding FEMA and the Department of Justice remained as symbols of the ongoing struggle for a more transparent and accountable government. The modern political landscape is increasingly defined by the rapid dissemination of information, which places a unique burden on the shoulders of executive leadership. In the contemporary era, the traditional gatekeepers of information have been bypassed by digital platforms that allow for the instantaneous spread of both fact and fiction. During the legislative hearing, the accusations regarding the spread of misinformation highlighted a profound concern about the integrity of official government communications. Representative Moskowitz pointed to a dangerous trend where the pursuit of political advantage appears to outweigh the commitment to factual accuracy. When high-ranking officials utilize their platforms to propagate unverified claims, they risk poisoning the well of public discourse for generations to come. The challenge of governing in an environment saturated with conflicting narratives requires a steadfast adherence to the principles of transparency and evidence-based policy. In the American system, the credibility of the government is its most valuable asset in maintaining social order and public cooperation during emergencies. If the citizenry begins to perceive that their leaders are intentionally misleading them for partisan gain, the foundational social contract is severely weakened. The hearing exposed a deep-seated anxiety that the administrative state is being weaponized to serve an ideological agenda rather than the public interest. This erosion of trust is not a temporary setback but a systemic threat that could undermine the effectiveness of future crisis responses. The psychological impact of inflammatory rhetoric on a polarized populace cannot be overstated, as it often serves as a catalyst for further civil unrest. When leaders like Secretary Noem are accused of using provocative language, it raises questions about the ethical responsibilities of those who hold the highest offices in the land. Instead of acting as a stabilizing force, the rhetoric described in the transcript was framed as a deliberate attempt to heighten tensions for political leverage. Such a strategy may provide short-term gains in terms of base mobilization, but it inflicts long-term damage on the social fabric of the nation. The legislative chamber thus became a venue for debating the very definition of responsible leadership in a world where words can be as impactful as actions. The phenomenon of confirmation bias is often exacerbated by the way information is presented by official government sources during times of national trauma. When a government official quickly labels a violent act with a politically charged term, it reinforces existing prejudices and shuts down meaningful dialogue. Moskowitz's critique of the domestic terrorism label was a direct challenge to the practice of using legal categories as a means of framing public perception before the facts are fully known. This practice can lead to a state of permanent grievance where different segments of society operate under entirely different sets of perceived realities. The role of a leader must be to bridge these realities through a commitment to objective truth and the slow but necessary process of investigation. The debate over accountability also touches upon the internal culture of federal agencies and the pressure placed on civil servants to align with political narratives. If the professional staff at agencies like FEMA or the Department of Justice feel compelled to alter their findings to suit a political agenda, the entire meritocratic system is in jeopardy. The integrity of the American bureaucracy depends on the ability of experts to provide honest and sometimes inconvenient assessments to their political superiors. When this flow of information is corrupted by the fear of reprisal or the desire for political favor, the quality of governance inevitably declines. The hearing served as a critical reminder that the protection of the civil service from political interference is essential for a functioning democracy. The global perception of American stability is often tied to how the nation handles its internal conflicts and the degree to which its leaders adhere to the rule of law. When international observers witness a breakdown in communication and a reliance on inflammatory rhetoric, it can weaken the diplomatic standing of the United States. The internal debates captured in the transcript reflect a broader struggle to maintain the image of a stable and predictable global leader. A government that is perceived as being at war with its own institutions or its own people loses the moral authority required to lead on the world stage. Therefore, the call for accountability and transparent leadership is not just a domestic concern, but a matter of national security and international influence. The evolution of political communication has made it increasingly difficult to hold officials accountable for the nuance of their statements in the public sphere. The hearing attempted to cut through the fog of political spin by demanding direct answers to specific questions about the management of national crises. By focusing on the tangible actions and words of Secretary Noem, the committee sought to establish a clear record of administrative conduct. This process is vital because history is often written based on the official transcripts and legislative records that survive the heat of the moment. The commitment to a transparent public record is the only way to ensure that future generations can judge the actions of today's leaders with clarity and fairness. Digital literacy among government officials is no longer an optional skill but a core requirement for ensuring the safety and informed status of the public. The spread of misinformation is often facilitated by a lack of understanding regarding the speed and reach of modern communication networks. When a high-ranking official makes a statement, it is amplified millions of times over through various channels, creating an immediate and often irreversible impact on public opinion. The legislative scrutiny of the Trump administration's communication strategies reflects a growing awareness of the power inherent in the digital pulpit. The hearing emphasized that with great communication power comes an even greater responsibility to ensure that the message is grounded in reality and delivered with the intent to inform rather than to inflame. The structural integrity of the American Republic relies heavily on the friction generated by the system of checks and balances designed by the constitutional architects. When this friction transitions from a healthy tension into a state of total institutional paralysis, the very survival of the democratic experiment is called into question. The legislative hearing involving Representative Moskowitz and the executive appointees highlighted a significant rupture in the traditional protocols of cooperation between branches. Oversight is not merely a procedural formality but a vital organ of government that ensures no single individual can operate without public accountability. When the executive branch resists these inquiries, it creates a dangerous precedent that can lead to the unchecked expansion of administrative power. The struggle for constitutional oversight is often fought in the shadows of procedural delays and legal maneuvers that obfuscate the true nature of executive actions. By demanding the appearance of Attorney General Pam Bondi, the committee was asserting its right to investigate the legal justifications for controversial administration policies. This demand underscores a growing concern that the Department of Justice has been repurposed as a protective shield for the presidency rather than an independent enforcer of the law. In the American legal tradition, the Attorney General owes a primary allegiance to the Constitution and the people rather than to the political fortunes of the appointing president. The hearing served as a public forum to contest this shift in institutional loyalty and to demand a return to objective legal standards. The erosion of political norms often begins with the subtle normalization of rhetoric that bypasses traditional channels of verification and diplomatic restraint. When officials choose to ignore the findings of career professionals in favor of politically expedient narratives, it signals a decline in the value placed on expertise. The hearing revealed a deep divide between the legislative demand for factual transparency and the executive preference for strategic ambiguity during times of crisis. This conflict is not just about the details of a single event, but about the fundamental methodology of modern American governance. If the standard for truth becomes whatever is most politically advantageous at the moment, the entire framework of public policy will inevitably crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. The role of the Secretary of Homeland Security and other high-ranking officials in managing the response to violence is a test of both logistical capability and moral clarity. Moskowitz's portrayal of Secretary Noem's actions as a national embarrassment was an attempt to redefine the standards of acceptable conduct for public servants. It was argued that the rush to define a crisis through a partisan lens is a dereliction of duty that endangers the lives of those the government is sworn to protect. A leader's first responsibility in the aftermath of tragedy is to provide a sense of stability and a clear path toward justice through the proper legal channels. When this responsibility is neglected in favor of inflammatory rhetoric, the result is a society that is more divided and less secure than it was before the crisis began. The power of the subpoena is the most potent weapon in the arsenal of a congressional committee seeking to expose the inner workings of a recalcitrant administration. It represents the collective authority of the people to demand answers from those who exercise power in their name and with their tax dollars. The refusal to comply with such demands is often framed as a defense of executive privilege, but it can also be seen as an admission of administrative failure. The tension surrounding the potential testimony of Pam Bondi reflected the high stakes of this constitutional tug-of-war, where the prize is the control over the national narrative. Transparency is the only mechanism that can prevent the gradual slide toward a form of governance that operates beyond the reach of public scrutiny and legal restraint. Administrative law in the United States is predicated on the idea that every agency action must be supported by a rational basis and a factual record. When FEMA is accused of mismanagement, it is not merely a political talking point but a potential violation of the Administrative Procedure Act. The hearing sought to uncover whether the decisions made during the crisis were based on the agency's statutory mission or on external political pressure. If the distribution of aid is influenced by the political map rather than the map of human need, the entire concept of federal assistance is corrupted. This investigation is essential to restore the faith of the American people in the impartiality of their government's most critical emergency response systems. The concept of executive privilege has long been a flashpoint in the relationship between the President and Congress, particularly during periods of intense investigation. While the Supreme Court has recognized a limited right to keep certain internal communications confidential, this privilege is not an absolute shield against criminal or legislative inquiry. The hearing challenged the administration's interpretation of this privilege by arguing that it was being used to hide incompetence rather than to protect national security. By forcing a confrontation over the disclosure of internal documents, the committee was reaffirming the principle that no one is above the law. This legal battle is a critical component of the ongoing effort to define the proper boundaries of executive authority in the 21st century. Constitutional scholars have often debated the unitary executive theory, which posits that the president should have near total control over the administrative branch of government. The hearing served as a real-world critique of this theory by demonstrating the dangers of centralized power when it is used to suppress dissent and avoid oversight. When the president's appointees prioritize loyalty to the executive over their statutory obligations to Congress, the system of checks and balances begins to fail. Moskowitz's aggressive questioning was a direct rejection of the idea that the executive branch can operate as an island unto itself. The preservation of a co-equal legislature is the only way to ensure that the government remains a servant of the people rather than a master of the citizenry. The historical precedent for congressional investigations dates back to the early years of the Republic, when leaders understood that power left unchecked would naturally tend toward corruption. From the Teapot Dome scandal to the Watergate hearings, the American people have relied on their representatives to shine a light on the dark corners of the executive branch. The current session regarding Secretary Noem and the Trump administration follows in this long tradition of seeking truth through adversarial inquiry. While the proceedings are often characterized by partisan bickering, the underlying purpose is the protection of the constitutional order. Every document requested and every witness called is part of a larger effort to ensure that the historical record reflects the reality of the government's actions. The polarization of the electorate has created a situation where even the most basic facts of an investigation are viewed through a partisan lens. This makes the job of the committee even more difficult, as they must navigate a media environment that is often more interested in conflict than in substance. The hearing was an attempt to create a definitive account of the administration's handling of recent crises that would stand up to both legal and public scrutiny. By focusing on the specific words and actions of officials, the committee was trying to build a case for accountability that transcends simple political disagreement. The success of this effort depends on the ability of the legal and legislative systems to remain focused on the fundamental principles of the Constitution. Institutional trust is a fragile commodity that, once broken, is incredibly difficult to rebuild, especially in an age of instant communication and deep social division. The hearing captured the moment when the trust between the people and their government was at its lowest point due to perceived administrative failures. When a leader is described as a national embarrassment, it signifies a breakdown in the respect that is usually afforded to the high officers of the state. This loss of respect is not just a personal insult, but a sign of a deeper crisis of legitimacy for the institutions themselves. The work of the committee is therefore not just about punishment, but about the restoration of the standards that make democratic governance possible. The role of the Attorney General in advising the President, while also serving as the nation's chief law enforcement officer, creates an inherent potential for conflict. This conflict becomes acute when the President's actions or policies are the subject of intense legal and legislative scrutiny. The call for Pam Bondi's testimony was a way to force a resolution to this conflict by demanding that she account for her legal counsel in a public setting. If the Department of Justice is seen as a partisan tool, it undermines the credibility of every legal action the government takes. The hearing emphasized that the legal framework of the nation must be managed by those who prioritize the law above all other considerations. As the session continued, the focus shifted to the broader implications of administrative neglect on the most vulnerable members of the population. Those who rely on FEMA for life-saving assistance are the ones who suffer the most when an agency is poorly managed or politically compromised. The questioning of Secretary Noem was a way to give a voice to those who have been left behind by the government's failure to act effectively. Accountability in this sense is a form of justice for those who have been harmed by the incompetence or indifference of their leaders. The hearing served as a reminder that the ultimate purpose of all government power is the protection and service of the people. The culmination of a legislative hearing of this magnitude inevitably shifts the focus from immediate grievances to the enduring principles of democratic governance and leadership. The intense exchange between Representative Moskowitz and the administration's representative serves as a profound case study in the struggle for moral clarity within the corridors of power. As the dust settles, the primary question remains whether the American political system can internalize these lessons to prevent a recurrence of such administrative and communicative failures. Accountability is not merely a retrospective act of casting blame, but a forward-looking necessity to reinforce the guardrails of the Republic. The pursuit of a more transparent government requires a constant vigilance that transcends the term limits of any single politician or appointee. Leadership in the 21st century demands a sophisticated understanding of the interconnectedness between policy decisions, public rhetoric, and social stability. The criticisms leveled against Secretary Noem highlight a perceived deficiency in the empathetic and factual dimensions of crisis management that the public now expects. When a government fails to meet these expectations, it creates a void that is often filled by cynicism and a general withdrawal from civic participation. To bridge this gap, future leaders must prioritize the restoration of institutional integrity over the fleeting benefits of partisan point scoring. The hearing provided a blueprint for the type of rigorous questioning that is necessary to hold the executive branch to these higher standards of conduct. The demand for the testimony of Attorney General Pam Bondi also symbolizes a broader movement toward reclaiming the independence of the American legal apparatus. A Department of Justice that is perceived as a partisan instrument is a department that has lost its primary function as the guardian of equal protection. Rebuilding this independence will require a concerted effort from both the legislative branch and the legal profession to insulate the office from political pressure. The integrity of the law is the only stable ground upon which a diverse society can negotiate its differences without resorting to conflict. This legislative session has underscored that the health of the legal system is directly tied to the transparency of its highest-ranking officials. The management of FEMA must be reimagined as a purely technocratic and humanitarian endeavor that is strictly shielded from the vagaries of electoral politics. When disaster strikes, the federal response should be as predictable and objective as the laws of physics, regardless of the political leanings of the affected region. The allegations of mismanagement discussed during the hearing should serve as a catalyst for comprehensive reforms that strengthen the agency's professional core. Ensuring that FEMA is led by qualified experts rather than political loyalists is a fundamental step toward protecting the American people from future catastrophes. The effectiveness of emergency management is one of the most tangible measures of a government's competence and its commitment to the welfare of its citizens. The rejection of blind political loyalty in favor of constitutional duty is perhaps the most significant theme to emerge from this historical record of dissent. Representative Moskowitz's actions exemplify the role of the legislator as a watchdog whose primary allegiance is to the truth and the constitutional order. This stance requires a level of political courage that is often tested by the pressures of party discipline and the demands of a polarized base. However, it is exactly this kind of independent oversight that prevents the slow descent into an authoritarian style of governance where the executive is beyond reproach. The future of the American Republic depends on the willingness of its representatives to put the principles of the nation above the interests of their party. A transparent government is one that is not afraid to admit its mistakes and to provide a clear account of its decision-making processes to the people. The hearing exposed a culture of defensive posturing and strategic silence that only serves to deepen public suspicion and accelerate the erosion of trust. Moving forward, there must be a renewed commitment to a culture of openness that treats the public as a partner in governance rather than an audience to be managed. This shift requires a fundamental change in how information is shared and how officials are vetted for positions of high public trust. Only by embracing a radical form of transparency can the government hope to regain the confidence of a skeptical and divided citizenry. The classification of national events and the language used to describe them must be handled with a level of care that reflects the gravity of the legal and social consequences involved. The rush to label complex situations with politically charged terms like domestic terrorism must be replaced by a commitment to thorough investigation and factual reporting. Leaders must understand that their words have the power to shape reality, and that with this power comes a profound responsibility to be accurate and fair. The hearing served as a warning that the misuse of language for political gain will eventually be met with intense scrutiny and public condemnation. This lesson is vital for any future administration that seeks to lead a nation through the challenges of civil unrest and internal division. The legacy of the Trump administration's handling of these crises will continue to be a subject of intense debate among historians, legal scholars, and political analysts for decades. The evidence presented during the hearing provides a critical data point in this ongoing assessment of executive power and administrative conduct in the modern era. By documenting the failures of leadership and the breakdowns in oversight, the committee has ensured that these events cannot be easily erased or reinterpreted. This record serves as both a warning to future leaders and a guide for those who seek to reform the American system from within. The pursuit of truth is a continuous process that requires an unwavering commitment to the facts, even when they are inconvenient or uncomfortable. The strength of the American system is not found in the perfection of its leaders, but in the resilience of its institutions and the persistence of its people in demanding better. The hearing was a manifestation of this resilience, showing that even in times of extreme polarization, the mechanisms of accountability still function. While the outcomes of such sessions may not lead to immediate change, they set the stage for the gradual process of reform and the eventual restoration of standards. The public's engagement with these proceedings is a sign of a healthy democracy that refuses to accept the normalization of incompetence or the abandonment of truth. Every citizen who pays attention and demands answers is a vital part of the effort to keep the government accountable to the people. As the nation moves forward from this period of turmoil, it must do so with a clear understanding of the risks posed by the unchecked expansion of executive authority. The lessons of the hearing regarding FEMA, the Department of Justice, and the use of inflammatory rhetoric must be encoded into the DNA of future administrations. We must strive for a government that is led by individuals of character who view their roles as a sacred trust rather than a personal or political platform. The vision of a transparent and accountable leadership is not an unachievable ideal but a necessary goal for the survival of the Republic. This legislative record stands as a testament to the belief that even in the darkest hours of political division, the light of truth can still prevail.